My name is Callum. I am 26 years old, and for most of those years I have been carrying a secret that I was absolutely certain would destroy every single thing I had built if it ever came to light.
My job.
My friendships. The carefully constructed image of myself that I had been maintaining since roughly the age of 13, when I first understood that certain things I felt were not things I was supposed to feel, and that the safest response to that understanding was to go very quiet and stay that way. I want to tell you this story properly. From the beginning, or at least from the beginning of the part that matters, the part that finally broke open and let the light in. Because for a long time, I told myself there was no story to tell. I told myself it was just a passing thing, a curiosity, something that would fade if I ignored it long enough. I ignored it for 11 years. It did not fade. I grew up in a mid-sized town, the kind of place that is neither small enough to feel intimate nor large enough to feel anonymous. My father worked in logistics, my mother taught secondary school. I have one brother, older than me by 4 years, the kind of brother who took up space easily and loudly in a way I never could. My family was not unkind. There was nothing dramatic about my childhood, no trauma I could point to and say that is where it comes from, which I know is what some people expect from a story like this one. But that is not how it was. It was just something in me. Something I noticed gradually, and then with increasing clarity. A pull toward things I was not supposed to pull toward. An interest in textures and silhouettes, and the way certain kinds of clothes moved when people wore them. A feeling that the category I had been placed in at birth did not quite account for the whole of what I was. I did not have language for any of this at 15. I barely have perfect language for it now. What I had at 15 was a growing sense of something unresolved and a very strong survival instinct that told me to keep it extremely quiet.
So I did.
I became, in the language of the people around me, a pretty normal young man. Quiet, reliable, decent enough at school, better at staying out of trouble than at anything else. I played football for 2 seasons and then stopped because I was not very good at it. I had friendships that were genuine but kept at a certain depth, where you know someone well enough to spend real time with them, but not so well that they start to see the things you are managing underneath the surface. I kept my rooms tidy. I kept my face neutral. I kept the thing inside me locked in the back of a drawer in my mind, and I walked through my days performing Callum, the reliable, uncomplicated, unremarkable young man, and I got quite good at it. The problem with getting good at a performance is that you have to sustain it. I moved to the city when I was 21, for work, which was both a practical decision and a relief. The city offered something my hometown never had, which was anonymity. In the city, no one was watching. No one cared what you did in your flat on a Saturday morning. No one was going to run into your mother and mention something. I got a job in data management, which suited me because it required precision and quiet, and did not involve performing charisma at high volume. I rented a flat on the 4th floor of a building that had slightly thin walls but was in a decent area and had a good amount of natural light. I settled into a routine. I made a small number of friends, slowly and carefully. And for about 1.5 years, I kept the drawer locked. Then, one Saturday in November, 2 days after my 22nd birthday, I was in a charity shop on the high street buying a coat because my old one had given out, and I walked past a rail of women's clothing that was just there, just hanging in the usual disorganized way of charity shop rails, and something in me turned over like a key in a lock. I stood there for what was probably only 30 seconds, touching the sleeve of a dark wrap dress, feeling the fabric between my fingers, and the drawer in my mind, the one I had kept so carefully locked for so long, swung open. I left the shop without buying anything. I walked home fast with my hands in my pockets and my jaw tight. I sat at my kitchen table for a while, and then I opened my laptop and I started reading for the first time about other people who had felt what I felt. And I read for 3 hours. And by the end of 3 hours, I was sitting in my kitchen with tears on my face that I had not given myself permission to cry. That was the beginning of the end of the locked drawer. But the public part, the going out part, that was still 4 years away. In those 4 years, I explored quietly and carefully and entirely in private. I want to be straightforward about this because I think honesty is the only thing that makes this kind of story worth telling. I built a private life alongside my regular life. Not a dramatic secret identity, not anything dangerous or harmful, Just a version of myself that I only let exist in the locked flat on Saturday mornings and occasional weekday evenings. I learned, slowly and with a lot of trial and error, what felt right. Not in terms of performing a character, but in terms of the way certain things felt when I put them on, the way my relationship with my own body and my own reflection changed, the way the restless, dissatisfied feeling I had carried for so long became quieter in those private hours. I learned how to do my own makeup, badly at first, and then, over years of practice, less badly. I learned which silhouettes worked for my frame and which did not. I learned the difference between the quality of fabric that feels immediately right and the kind that feels like a costume. I built a small collection of things, nothing extravagant, just a handful of pieces that I kept in a box at the top of my wardrobe behind things I never moved. No one knew.
Not a single person in my life.
And that was bearable for a while, because the private hours gave me enough of what I needed to get through the weeks. It was like breathing through a very small opening, not full breath, not the deep satisfying kind, but enough to stay alive. But something shifted in my 25th year. The something was a feeling I could not argue away, a sense that the small opening was no longer enough, that I had been breathing through it for years and my lungs were still not full, that the life I was living was genuine in many ways, but that there was a part of me that only existed for a few hours a week and then went back in the box, and that part deserved more than a box. And underneath that feeling, very frightening and very insistent, was the thought, I want to go outside. Not permanently. Not to make a statement or an announcement. Just to exist briefly in the world, as the version of myself I only ever allowed in private.
Just to walk down a street. To go into a shop. To sit in a cafe.
To be in the world as the whole of what I was, just once, and see what happened. The thought terrified me. I lived with it for 8 months before I did anything about it. During those 8 months, I argued with myself extensively. I listed all the reasons it was a bad idea. I was recognizable in my neighborhood. Someone from work might see me. Someone from my old life might happen to be visiting the city. What if something went wrong?
What if someone said something?
What if I could not pass, which was a thought that carried its own complicated shame, the idea that my acceptability was conditional on being undetectable. I sat with all of those fears and I named them and I turned them over. And then one morning in late September, a year and a few months ago now, I woke up and I thought, I am going to do this. Not today, but I am going to do this. And I am going to do it properly. I spent 3 weeks preparing. This is the part where I need to go slowly because the preparation matters, not just as practical detail, but because of what the preparation felt like. 3 weeks of slow, careful, private intention. The most deliberate thing I had done in years. The first week, I thought only about what I wanted to wear. Not what I thought I should wear, not what would be safest or most concealing, but what felt most like the thing I was trying to express. I had a navy blue midi skirt that I had owned for a year and worn privately several times, a soft fabric, matte finish, the kind of weight that moved when you walked in a way I had always loved. I had a cream blouse with a simple collar that sat well and felt clean. I had a pair of low-heeled ankle boots, dark brown, that I had bought 8 months earlier and worn precisely 3 times in my flat. I also had, by this point, a reasonable level of skill with makeup. Not theatrical skill, not editorial skill, but the kind of skill that came from years of careful practice in private, the ability to do a face that looked intentional and clean and did not call attention to itself. Second week, I thought about where. This required a different kind of thought. I did not want my neighborhood. Too many familiar faces. I did not want somewhere completely unknown. The anxiety of pure disorientation on top of everything else would be too much. I settled on an area of the city I knew fairly well, but did not have daily life in. A shopping street with cafes and bookshops and the kind of steady flow of strangers that makes individuals invisible. Third week, I thought about when, and I thought about what I would do if something went wrong, and I sat with the fear that had been my companion for so long, and I tried to understand it more precisely. What was I actually afraid of? Humiliation. Being visibly clocked, which is the word for being recognized as not what you appear to be. Someone being cruel. Someone I knew seeing me. I sat with each of those fears and I said, and if that happens, what then? And I talked myself through each scenario, and I found that none of them, not even the worst case, was actually unsurvivable. Embarrassing, yes. Painful, possibly. But not the end of the world. Not the structural collapse I had been treating them as for 23 years. That realization, quiet and unspectacular as it was its own small revolution. I chose a Saturday in mid-October. Late morning, when the street would be busy enough to be anonymous but not so crowded that navigation would be stressful. I gave myself a time limit in my head, 2 hours, with permission to cut it shorter if I needed to. The Friday night before, I did not sleep well. I lay in bed in the dark and my brain produced a very thorough and creative catalog of everything that could go wrong, which was not helpful but was also probably inevitable. I let it run. I watched the ceiling. Around 3 in the morning, I felt a shift, not calm exactly, but a kind of grim resolution, the feeling you get before something difficult that you have decided to do anyway. I got up at 7 on Saturday. Earlier than I needed to, but I could not stay in bed. I showered carefully and methodically. I moisturized, which I had learned mattered to how makeup sat. I made coffee and drank half of it standing in the kitchen in my dressing gown, and then set the cup down because my hands were slightly unsteady, and I did not want to spill it. Then I went to the bathroom, and I started on my face. I want to describe this properly because it was not a quick or casual process, and the care of it was part of what made it meaningful. I started with primer, working it into the skin with the tips of my fingers, that slightly silky feeling as the product smoothed over everything, preparing the surface. My face in the mirror at this stage looked the same as always, just slightly more even, and I looked at it and breathed and told myself to stay with the process and not to start catastrophizing yet. Foundation next. My shade, mixed carefully from 2 products to get it right, and I applied it with a damp sponge in the way I had practiced so many times, working outward from the center of the face, building it gently, not packing it, blending carefully at the hairline and the jaw. My hands were steadier than I expected. I focused on the work and not on the morning that was waiting for me outside. Concealer under the eyes, which I had never quite mastered but had gotten reasonably good at. A small amount, tapped in gently with the ring finger the way every tutorial had told me, the lightest touch for the thinnest skin. Setting powder, translucent and light, pressed gently over everything with a fluffy brush. The face in the mirror looked clean and even, and I looked at it, and something in my chest settled just slightly. Then the part one had spent the most practice time on, which was the eyes. Not dramatic, not heavy. A warm neutral palette, tawny brown in the crease, a lighter shimmery shade on the lid, a darker shadow taken just below the outer lower lash line for definition. I had done this maybe 60 times in private, and I knew the sequence by muscle memory now, which was useful when my hands wanted to shake. The liner, a brown-black pencil, tight to the upper lash line and smudged very slightly, which I had learned gave a softer effect than a clean line. The mascara, 2 coats, waiting for the first to dry before applying the second. I stepped back and looked. My face looked like the face I had been practicing toward. The face I had been working on for 4 years of Saturday mornings alone in my flat. It looked like a face that was mine. Lips last. A soft berry brown, applied with a lip brush, slightly more precise than applying directly from the bullet. I blotted on tissue once, and then applied a second thin layer. I looked at the result. I stood at that bathroom mirror for a long moment. I was still Callum. Obviously, unmistakably. I was not under any illusion that I had become someone else or that the person in the mirror was unrecognizable to anyone who knew me. But I was Callum with all of myself present, and the difference between that and the version I performed every day was something I could see clearly. I went to the bedroom. The skirt first. I had laid everything out the night before, which was a practical decision but had also been, in itself, a kind of ceremony, the choosing and arranging of things. The navy skirt went on and settled at my waist and fell to mid-calf, and the fabric moved when I moved, that specific light responsiveness I had always loved about it. I tucked the cream blouse in carefully at the front and left it slightly loose at the back. I smoothed everything down. The boots. I sat on the bed to put them on and laced them carefully and stood up. The heel was low, 1.5 inches at most, practical really, but they changed my gait slightly in a way I was aware of and had practiced. I checked the mirror. I looked at myself for a long time. The person in the mirror was wearing an outfit that was clean and considered, and nothing about it was theatrical or extreme. Just a person in a skirt and blouse and boots on an autumn Saturday. Normal. The most normal thing in the world, really, except for the fact that I had been building toward this moment for 4 years, and my heart was beating so hard I could feel it against the inside of my ribs. I picked up a small crossbody bag. Dark tan leather, secondhand, the strap worn smooth. I put my keys and my phone and my wallet in it. I put a lip product in it. I stood in my hallway with the bag on my shoulder, and I looked at the front door. I stood there for 3 minutes. This is not an exaggeration. I know it was approximately 3 minutes because I was watching the time on my phone with a kind of desperate, dissociated attention, one of those coping mechanisms you develop when you are very frightened and your body needs something concrete to focus on. 3 minutes of standing in my hallway, feeling the skirt against my legs, feeling my heartbeat in my throat, telling myself to breathe. And then I put my hand on the door handle, and I opened the door, and I stepped out. The hallway of my building was empty, which I registered with a relief so acute it was almost dizzying. I walked to the stairs rather than the lift because I could not bear the enclosed space of the lift right now, and I went down 4 flights with my hand on the banister, my footsteps careful, and even in the unfamiliar heels. The lobby was also empty. I pushed through the front door of the building, and I was outside. The air hit my face first, that October chill, sharp and clean. I breathed it in and stood on the pavement in front of my building for a moment, getting my bearings. The street was doing what streets do on Saturday mornings, a couple of people walking dogs, a car going past, a few figures in the middle distance. Ordinary. The ordinary world, carrying on as it did. No one looked at me. I started walking. This is difficult to describe accurately because the feeling was so layered, and I was having so many of them simultaneously. There was the physical reality of it, the cold air, and the pavement under my feet, and the particular sensation of the skirt moving against my legs with every step, which was different outside than in a flat. Something about the openness of the space made it more present. There was the adrenaline, running high and continuous, the kind that does not make you feel powerful but makes everything feel slightly too bright and slightly too real. There was the fear, not a sharp fear but a kind of surrounding hum, the awareness of my own visibility in a way I was not usually aware of it. And underneath all of that, quiet and persistent, something else. I took the tube 2 stops to the area I had chosen, and this was, I want to tell you honestly, the most frightening part. A tube carriage is an enclosed space with strangers in very close proximity, and being in it in this context was different from anything I had experienced before. I sat down, and I kept my eyes forward, and I held the strap of my bag with both hands, and I breathed. A woman sat across from me and looked in my general direction, and then looked at her phone. A man standing near the door did not look at me at all. 2 teenagers near the other end of the carriage were absorbed in something on one of their phones and laughing quietly. No one was looking at me with particular attention. No one was reacting to me as an anomaly. By the time the tube reached my stop, I had regulated my breathing to something close to normal. I came up out of the station into the October morning, and the street opened up around me, wide and busy, and full of the unremarkable Saturday activity of a city going about its business. I stood for a moment at the top of the station steps and let the scene arrange itself. And then I walked into it. I want to be honest about what the next 2 hours were like, because I think the reality of it is more useful than any cleaned-up version I could offer you. The first 20 minutes were still frightening. My awareness of myself was extremely high. I was conscious of every step, the way I moved, whether I was walking in a way that looked natural or whether something about my gait was calling attention. I passed a group of women coming out of a coffee shop, and I registered them with a spike of anxiety, and then registered that they were talking among themselves and barely glanced in my direction. I went into a bookshop, not because I needed a book, because a bookshop is a place where people look at shelves rather than at each other, which felt like exactly the right level of public exposure to begin with. I spent about 20 minutes in the bookshop. I moved through the sections. I looked at covers. I picked up a few things and read the backs. A member of staff, a young woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, passed me in the narrow space between shelves and said, "Are you looking for anything in particular?" I said, "Just browsing, thank you." She said, "Let me know if you need help," and moved on. That was it. That was the whole interaction. I stood in the poetry section of that bookshop with a collection of poems in my hand, and my heart rate was coming down, and I could feel it coming down, and I thought, carefully and clearly, I am standing in a bookshop, and I am fine. I bought the book. A small, instinctive decision, reaching for my wallet and paying at the till, and the transaction being entirely unremarkable, and I walked out with the book in my bag. I found a cafe a little way down the street. Small, not too crowded, the kind with wooden tables and a handwritten menu on a blackboard. I went in and I ordered a flat white at the counter, and the barista, a young man with a sleeve tattoo and a polite manner, said that would be about 4 minutes, and I said thank you and found a seat by the window. I sat in that cafe with my flat white and my book and the October street visible through the window, and I tried to understand what I was feeling, because it was not what I had expected. I had expected, I think, one of two things. Either a glorious feeling of freedom and release, the triumphant arrival of the fully realized self, or an absolute disaster, exposure and humiliation, and everything I had feared coming true at once. I had mentally rehearsed both of those outcomes many times. What I actually felt was quieter than either. What I felt was normal. Not in the sense that it felt like every other Saturday morning, because it did not. The adrenaline was still there, humming low, and I was still conscious of myself in a way I usually was not. But the quality of it was shifting. The fear was becoming something else, not disappearing but changing shape, and what it was changing into was something that felt closer to aliveness than to terror. I was sitting in a cafe in the city on a Saturday morning. I was reading a book of poems. I was drinking a flat white. I was dressed in a way that felt honest and right and like something I had chosen. And the world was continuing around me with complete indifference. This sounds like a small thing. I want you to understand that for me, in that moment, it was immense. I sat in that cafe for 45 minutes. I finished my coffee and ordered a second one. I read most of the book I had bought. A couple came in and sat near me and argued quietly, and then laughed, and then argued again. A woman with a child who could not have been more than 4 years old sat down at the table across from mine, and the child immediately knocked her orange juice off the table, and the woman said, "Oh, for goodness sake," and I caught the woman's eye in the moment of shared recognition that often passes between adults when a child does something inevitably childlike, and the woman gave me a small, tired smile, and I gave one back. That smile. I know that sounds like nothing, but it was not nothing. It was a moment of ordinary, human connection. Unremarkable to anyone observing it, simply two people sharing a moment of mundane life. And I was present in it as the version of myself I had only ever allowed in private. And nothing about the moment acknowledged or required or refused any part of me. It was just a smile, and I was there for it, the whole of me. I left the cafe around noon and walked for another 20 minutes, just walking, just being in the street. I went into 2 more shops without any particular purpose. I stopped at a corner to look at something in a window display. I did all of these things, and none of them were dramatic, and all of them, every ordinary, unremarkable second of them, felt significant to me in a way I would not have known how to explain to anyone who had not lived inside a locked drawer for 11 years. And then, the thing happened that I had not planned for. The thing that turned this from a story about a quiet personal milestone into the kind of story I am telling you now. I had been walking for a while, and I was starting to feel the tiredness of sustained heightened awareness, that particular exhaustion of being very present for a long time, and I was thinking about heading back to the station when I heard my name. My name.
Callum.
I stopped. I turned around. Standing about 15 feet behind me on the pavement, holding a takeaway cup and looking at me with an expression I could not immediately read, was Priya. Priya was my closest friend at work. We had known each other for 3 years, sat near each other in the open plan office, eaten lunch together more times than I could count, had the kind of friendship that was genuine and warm and important to me and that I had been keeping as I kept all my friendships at a careful depth. She was the last person I would have wanted to see that morning. She was also, I understood in the following seconds, a person I had not given enough credit to. I stood on the pavement with Priya looking at me, and I felt my face do something I could not control. Not panic exactly, but the expression of someone who has been found in a place they did not expect to be found, a sudden transparency, All the careful composure I had been maintaining for the previous 2 hours suddenly unreliable. Priya walked toward me slowly, not hesitantly, thoughtfully. She stopped a few feet away. She looked at me for a moment, her expression not the one I had been afraid of, not horrified, not cruel, not performing shock for an imaginary audience. Just looking. Really looking.
She said, "Hi." I said, "Hi."
A pause. She said, "I was not expecting to see you here." I said, "No. Me neither." She looked at me again. Not up and down in an assessing way, just present, just taking in the reality of the situation with the same quiet attention she brought to things at work, the quality in her I had always quietly respected. She said, "How long have you been out?" And I understood immediately that she did not mean how long had I been outside the cafe. I said, "A couple of hours." She said, "First time?" I said, "First time outside." She nodded. She took a sip of her coffee. She looked at the street around us for a brief moment, and then back at me. She said, "Are you okay?" Those 3 words. The way she said them. Not "Are you alright," which is a social reflex that barely means anything, but "Are you okay?" in a tone that meant the question exactly. I said, "I think so. I was until just now." She said, "Because I ran into you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I understand that. But I want you to know that you can relax." I looked at her. She said, "I mean it. You can relax. I am standing here. I am looking at you, and nothing in me is reacting the way you are afraid I am reacting. Okay?" Something in my chest loosened slightly. Just slightly. I said, "I do not know what to say." She said, "You do not have to say anything. Can I walk with you for a bit?" I said, "Yes." We walked. For about 10 minutes we walked along the street together and did not talk about it directly, not yet, just walked and let the situation settle, which I think was exactly the right instinct on her part. We talked about a project at work we were both mildly frustrated with, and she said something funny about our manager's organizational habits, and I laughed, actually laughed, out there on the pavement in the mid-morning light, and the laugh surprised me with its own ordinariness. Then she said, "How long has this been part of your life?" I said, "Properly? A few years. In some form, much longer." She said, "And you have been doing this alone?"
I said, "Yes."
She said, "How come you never told me?" I said, "Because I was not sure how you would react. Because you're someone who matters to me, and I did not want to lose that." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is a reasonable fear to have. I am not going to pretend it is not, because the truth is you never know how people will respond. But I want to tell you something about how I am responding, if that is okay." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have known you for 3 years. I have eaten lunch with you probably 200 times. I know how you take your coffee, and I know that you always hold your ideas back in meetings until everyone else has had a chance to speak, and I know that you are the most reliable person in our office, and I know that when I went through that really difficult period about 18 months ago, you were the one who noticed before I had to say anything. I know Callum, and what I am looking at right now is Callum. Different details, same person. And the same person is still the same person I have been glad to know for 3 years." I stopped walking. Priya stopped too, and looked at me. I said, "I was so afraid of this moment." She said, "I know. I could see that from 15 feet away." I said, "And it is nothing like what I feared." She said, "Fear does that. Build something up until it is enormous, and then you meet the real thing, and it is just a thing." I said, "How are you so calm about this?" She said, "Because there is nothing here to be uncalm about. You are my friend. You are on a street. You are wearing a lovely skirt. The world has not ended." I looked at her. Priya, with her takeaway cup and her sensible coat and her 3 years of easy, genuine friendship that I had been treating as something conditional on my concealment. And I thought about all the times I had sat across from her at lunch and laughed and talked and maintained the careful performance, and how exhausting it had been, and how I had not let myself fully see how exhausting it was until right now, standing on this pavement with her saying clearly and simply that none of the concealment had been necessary. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Do not thank me for not being a bad person. That is a low bar." And I laughed again, and so did she, and we kept walking. We ended up in another cafe, different from the one I had been in before, and we sat across from each other and talked for almost 2 hours. Really talked. The kind of talking we had never quite done in 3 years of lunches because I had always been managing the depth, keeping things at a level where I was safe. We talked about this, about my life, about the years of it, the Thursday in the charity shop at 22 and the 4 years of careful private practice and the 8 months of wanting to go outside and the 3 weeks of preparation. Priya listened to all of it the way she listened to things, with her full attention, not filling silences before they needed filling. When I was done, she said, "I have a question, and it is a personal one, so you do not have to answer it." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "When you are doing this, when you are dressed this way, does it feel different? Like, different from the rest of the time?" I thought about it. I said, "The loneliness is different. Lower." She said, "You carry a lot of loneliness." I said, "I have for a long time. I am trying to be less good at it." She said, "Today is a good step in that direction." I said, "Today has been a lot of things." She said, "Did it go the way you expected?" I said, "No. Everything I expected was either disaster or a kind of triumphant relief, and it was neither. It was just normal. Frightening and then normal. That was the unexpected thing." She said, "The world is mostly normal. People are mostly just living their lives and not looking for things to be horrified by." I said, "I know that intellectually. But knowing it and experiencing it are different." She said, "That is very true." We sat in that cafe for a long time, and outside the October afternoon moved from midday toward the earlier dark that comes in autumn, and the light through the cafe window went from sharp and pale to softer and more golden, and I sat across from my friend, and I was entirely myself. It was the first time I had been entirely myself with another person in my life. 26 years of careful management, and one October Saturday, and it was over. Not because the world had proven itself completely safe, not because I had resolved every question about myself or my future, but because I had taken the step and met what was on the other side of it and found it survivable. More than survivable. When we left the cafe, Priya hugged me on the pavement, a proper hug, the kind you give when words have run out and you want the other person to know they are not alone, and I stood on that street in the October evening with my friend's arms around me, and I breathed. Then she said, "Are you getting the tube back?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I will walk you to the station." We walked to the station together. At the entrance she stopped and said, "One more thing." I said, "What?" She said, "The skirt is really good. The color is exactly right for you." I said, "Thank you." She went one way and I went down to the platform, and I stood on the tube home with my hand on the overhead bar and the carriage swaying around me, and I looked at my reflection in the dark window opposite me, and I thought about everything. What I thought about, mostly, was the gap between the thing I had been afraid of and the thing that had actually happened. Not just with Priya that afternoon, but with the whole day. The hours of build-up. The 3 weeks of preparation. The 8 months of wanting and not doing. The 4 years of private Saturday mornings. The 11 years of the locked drawer. And then 2 hours on a street that were frightening for 20 minutes, and then just ordinary life. I am not going to tell you that I had cracked the whole thing open by the time I got home. I am not going to pretend that one afternoon resolved the complexity of everything I had been carrying. I still had a lot to figure out about myself and about my life, and about what the ongoing honest version of it was going to look like. But I will tell you what I felt when I got home. I let myself into my flat, and I took off my coat, and I stood in my hallway. The same flat it had always been. The same quiet. The same particular quality of Saturday evening light coming through the windows. But something was different. The flat felt less like a place I was hiding and more like a place I lived. I went to the bathroom, and I looked at myself in the mirror. The makeup had held through the day. The skirt was still falling right. The person in the mirror was the same person who had stood in this bathroom 8 hours ago, shaking slightly, holding the doorframe, going out into the world for the first time. I looked at that person for a long time. I thought about Priya saying, "You can relax." I thought about the mother in the first cafe, with the child who knocked over the orange juice, and the small tired smile we had shared. I thought about the bookshop and the barista, and the 45 minutes sitting by the cafe window with my book, the world carrying on around me in its ordinary way. I thought about what Priya had said in the second cafe about loneliness, about the fact that she had seen it in 3 years of lunches, without my ever saying it out loud. about the way people who actually see you can see the things you have been carrying without you having to explain them. And I thought about the moment on the pavement when she said my name, and I turned around, and the world did not end. That moment when I feared it would. But it did not. I am going to tell you now about the weeks after. Not in great detail, because this story has a shape and I am trying to honor its shape, but enough for you to understand what the October Saturday set in motion. In the weeks after, things changed, not dramatically and not all at once, but they changed. I told Priya things I had never told anyone. She listened to them with the same calm, straightforward attention she had shown on the pavement, and she asked good questions, and she did not once make me feel that any of it was too much. We had the kind of friendship I had not let us have before, because I had been keeping one hand on the door, and now the door was open, and neither of us was leaving. I went out again. A second time, 3 weeks after the first, to a different area of the city, this time with less fear and more curiosity. A third time after that, on a Sunday, to a market. A fourth time, this one on an evening rather than a day, to an art exhibition that was free and open late. Each time was different. The anxiety reduced not linearly but in an uneven way, some outings easier than others, some days more difficult for no reason I could identify. But the underlying thing, the sense of being present in the world as the full version of myself, that was consistent. And it kept doing what it had done the first time, making the loneliness lower. I began to understand my own identity with more clarity. Not a rushed or forced clarity, but the gradual kind that comes from spending time with yourself honestly. I still did not have a neat single word for what I was, and I had made peace with not needing one. I understood that there was a dimension of myself that expressed through this, that the way I felt in certain clothes and in certain presentations of myself was connected to something real and important about who I was, not a performance, not a phase, not something that would eventually go away if I found the right approach to make it. It was just me, a part of me. A part that had been locked up for a long time and that had earned, through years of patience and secrecy and quiet survival, the right to exist in the open. I told 2 more people. Not in dramatic conversations, but in the way truths come out when you have stopped keeping them secret, naturally, and without great ceremony. One was my cousin Finn, who was close in age to me and with whom I had always had an easy relationship, and whose response was to look at me for a moment and then say, "Is this why you always had such good opinions about my outfits?" And I said, "Probably," and we laughed in the way that only happens with someone who loves you enough to find the lightness in something serious. The other was a colleague named Bastian who I had been careful around at work because he had always been slightly unpredictable in his reactions to things. But I miscalculated him too. He heard what I said and he nodded and he said, "That sounds like a lot to have been carrying alone." And then he asked if I wanted to get a coffee, and we got a coffee and we talked about something else entirely, and the ease of that was its own kind of small gift. I am telling you these things not to suggest that every disclosure goes perfectly, because I do not know that that is universally true, and I would not want to mislead you. I am telling you because in my specific case, the people I chose to tell, slowly and carefully and at my own pace, responded with more grace than I had given them credit for. And I think part of that was that by the time I told them, I was telling them from a place of more settled confidence about myself, not asking for their permission or their verdict, just offering them the truth. There is a difference between telling someone a secret because you cannot carry it anymore and telling someone something true because you trust them to receive it. The first is desperation and the second is intimacy. I had spent 23 years in desperation, carrying it alone. The October Saturday, and everything it opened began the slow shift toward the second thing. Now I want to tell you about March, 6 months after the October Saturday, because March is where the last piece settled into place. My parents came to visit. They came every few months, my mother and father, the trip from their house to my flat in the city a matter of 2 hours by train. These visits were usually pleasant and slightly effortful in the specific way that adult family relationships can be, warm and genuine, but also containing the accumulated habits of how we had always related to each other, which meant that certain things were approached and other things were not. I had been thinking about this visit for weeks, not with the paralyzing anxiety of before, but with a kind of serious, purposeful thought. I had decided something, in the way you decide things when you have been living more honestly for long enough that the dishonesty in the remaining places becomes harder to sustain. I was not going to tell them everything on this visit. I was not going to arrive at the door in a skirt and announce a revelation. That was not the right approach for me, and not the right approach for us. But I had decided that I was going to tell them something, a beginning, a first honest sentence that could lead eventually to the fuller truth. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, my mother with a cake she always brought, and my father with a slightly stiff warmth that was his way, and we sat in my kitchen and drank tea and talked about ordinary things for a while. And then, in a pause in the conversation, I said, "There is something I want to tell you both."
My mother looked at me.
My father looked at me. The particular quality of parental attention, the complete focus that arrives when a child, however old, uses those words. I said, "I've been doing some things privately for a few years that I have not talked about, to do with how I dress and how I present myself. I am still working out exactly how to describe it, and I do not have a complete explanation yet. But it is something important to who I am, and I have been keeping it from you, and I do not want to do that anymore." My parents looked at each other. My mother said, "Are you happy?" I said, "I am getting happier. More than I have been in a long time." She said, "Are you safe?"
I said, "Yes."
She said, "Then tell us more when you are ready. We are not going anywhere." My father did not say anything immediately. He looked at his cup for a moment. Then he looked at me and said, "I have noticed for years that something was held in you. I always thought it was just the way you were built. But I am glad to hear it is something you are working through." I said, "It has taken a while." He said, "Most worthwhile things do." We drank our tea. Later, when we were washing up and my father had gone to watch something in the living room, my mother stood beside me at the sink and said quietly, "You know you can always come to us. With anything. That has always been true."
I said, "I know."
I think I needed to know it more solidly than I did. She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I know it." She put her hand on my arm for a moment and then went back to the drawing. That was March. I have been thinking about how to end the story, not to wrap it up too neatly, because the truth is it does not end. The process of knowing yourself and living honestly does not arrive at a final chapter. It just keeps going, keeps requiring attention and honesty and the occasional act of courage. But I think there is an ending to this particular chapter, and it happened a few weeks after the March visit from my parents. It was a Saturday morning, an ordinary one, mid-April now, with the light coming back properly after winter, longer days, and the sense of things opening up that comes with the turn of the season. I was in my flat, and I was getting ready. The familiar ritual, the makeup and the clothes laid out the night before, the coffee made, the specific quiet of a Saturday morning that I'd come to love. But this time, I was not preparing to go out in secret or with the heightened vigilance of the November first time. I was getting ready to meet Priya and Fun for lunch, a plan we had made a week earlier, entirely casually, the way you make plans with people you are comfortable with. They both knew. Priya from the October pavement, Fun from the conversation a few months after. This lunch was just a lunch. I got ready and I looked in the mirror when I was done, and I saw myself, the version that had been locked in the back of a drawer for 23 years, now just the version that went to lunch with friends on a Saturday. I picked up my bag. I put on my coat. I went downstairs. Outside it was bright and cool, and the street was doing what streets do, carrying on with ordinary life in ordinary ways. I walked to the tube and took it 3 stops and came up into the Saturday morning and found the cafe where we were meeting and went in, and they were already there, Priya with her coffee and Fun with a tea, and they both looked up when I came in and Priya waved and Fun said loudly and warmly, "There you are." I sat down. We ordered food, and we talked about the things you talk about when you are with people who know.